It is a great joy to welcome to our pulpit here at All Souls this morning, Coretta Scott King.
Thank you so much for having me here this morning. The music, as I look at the musicians, and that is very close to my heart, but also that was a part of my husband, Dr. King. He often would say that music was the heart of the movement, and he spoke at the Berlin Jazz Festival. Thank you so much. I am indeed honored to be here, and I don't know if you all know that earlier in our relationship of my dating Dr. King, we attended the Unitarian churches. I was very involved with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And while in Boston, we attended the Unitarian churches. I'd like to start with a song that was one of Martin's favorite. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on marching, marching up to freedom's highway. That was one of Martin's favorite spirituals, one that I sang before he addressed the keynote speech at the Unitarian Universalist Association General Assembly in 1966. I'd like to read an excerpt from that he wrote, because you see, many people don't know that I was more than there just to grace the occasion. I would sit at our kitchen table and help devise with Martin his speeches, his sermons, and I want you to remember that his sermons always had 3 points. Don't sleep through the revolution. I need not to pause to say how delighted I am here tonight and have the privilege of being with you for this important meeting. And I want to express my warm and personal appreciation to Dr. Greeley and other members of the committee who extended the invitation. There are those wonderful moments in life when you speak before a group that is so near and dear that you don't feel like you have to engage in the art of persuasion. You don't feel like you are in the midst of strangers. You know that you are all with friends. And I can assure you that that is how I feel tonight. My own impersonal experience with the Unitarian Universalism began when I was a student at Boston University back in the early 1950s. I can remember on several occasions visiting Arlington Street Church, where your distinguished Dr. Greeley pastored at the time. And I can remember beyond that, in the early years of my ministry, indeed, beyond that early years of the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, 3 of your ministers visited and encouraged me during that very trying and often difficult period. I refer to David Cole, Alfred Hawkins, and my dear friend who was on the platform with me tonight here, Homer Jackson. Since that time, I have worked with Dr. Jack in Montgomery, in Ghana, West Africa, in Washington, in the World Peace Effort, and also in Selma. I also want to acknowledge your massive participation through your Commission on Religion and Race in the events of Alabama during 1965. Now, the support expressed both before and after the death of your colleague and mine, the Unitarian Universalist Reverend James J. Reeb. We grieve at the death of Mr. Reeb, and I was glad to participate in his memorial service at the historic Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma. So you see that Dr. King and our relationship with the Unitarian Church goes way back. And we considered joining the Unitarian Church. However, we knew that if we joined the Unitarian Church, we would not have a movement. I'd like to take you back to how I met Dr. King, because I'm in the process of writing a book. It has only been 4 months since he has passed away, and I have not stopped. I am continuing with the movement, and I thank you all for having me here tonight, because as I sit and write my manuscript for my book, I am starting it with how I met him, which I met him in Boston. I was there training as a concert singer, and he was there for his PhD in systemic theology. And we met through a mutual friend, and I want to say that I can say it was not love at first sight. For you see, when our friend Mary Powell had called me, and I picked up the phone, and I said, "Hello, Mary," and she said, "Have you heard of Martin Luther King Jr.?" I said, No, Mary, I hadn't heard of him. And she said, "Well, he comes from a very good family, and also his mentor is Dr. Mays from Morehouse." I said, "I have not heard of him." And she said, "Well, he's a minister." I thought I was going to drop the phone. For you see, all I could think of was someone who is going to be stoic, and I wanted to be a trained concert singer. And this was not going to be complimenting my life. And he was a Baptist minister, and I was Methodist. But I went ahead and gave her permission to give my number, and he called me, and we talked for 20 minutes. And he said, "You know, I'm Napoleon at my Waterloo. I'm begging you, can we meet? I want to meet you in person." So 3 days later, we went on a date, and he was in a green Chevrolet. It was a gift from his parents. And he got out, and he did not have his signature mustache. I was looking for a man, not a boy. He looked like a little boy. However, I got in the car, and we went to Sharif's and had lunch, and we talked, and he talked about how he was going to kill Jim Crow. And we had several dates after that, and it began to turn into a love affair. And I remember the first time I was going to meet his parents. And Daddy King and Mama King, they were not too excited about me because they had other ladies that were waiting. And so I had to stand up for myself with Dr. King, his Daddy King, and say, "Well, Daddy King, I do have something to offer." And Martin at the dinner table, he said, "Mama King, Daddy King, I am going to marry Coretta. She's going to be my wife." So we were married at my parents' farm in Marion, Alabama. And we spent our first night, because there were no hotels that would accept my people. We spent the night at the home of an undertaker. Martin would often quip about that. "You know, Corey," as he called me, "well, we spent our first night." And going forward, as he said, "We're going to kill Jim Crow," I knew that this separate and not equal had to come to an end. I had become very active before I met Martin. My days at Antioch College in Yellow Springs, I dated a Jewish man. And I want that reflected in my book. 2 years we dated and we discussed the possibilities of being interracial, dating, and how that would affect us. And we decided to part because we didn't think there would be a future for us. But it was during my time here at Antioch I began to really hone my skills as a singer, and Paul Robeson, who I met, encouraged me to continue to develop my voice. And having Martin step into my life, I was juggling and I was in a dilemma. Would I give up my career to be a minister's wife, and a Baptist minister's wife at that? But he proposed 8 months later, and that would begin our life. I wanted to stay in the North because it was better for my people. We could move more freely. But he was determined to return back to the South because he had a mission. He was called, and I too was called. I was called not just to be his helpmate and walk behind him, but beside him and to advise him. And of course, December 1st, 1955 changed our whole life when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. I remember getting the call and giving it to Martin from E.D. Nixon, who was the president of the NAACP, and young Martin, who we had just taken on the role as Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, as the pastor. Dexter was known as the big folk church, where all the well-to-do black folk went. And so Martin was determined to make it inclusive of everyone, so he started programs, outreach, and they accepted it. But when E.D. Nixon called and he said, "Reverend King, you're a young minister, you're new in town, nobody knows you, and we've got to do something about what's going on." So Dr. King, he said at 3:00, let's have a meeting. And Dr. King and I sat at the kitchen table and we began calling everyone we knew who needed to be there. And at 3:00 at the meeting, over 40 community leaders, grassroots people were there. And they nominated and elected my husband as president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. He was a little reluctant to tell me that and share that with me, because you see, 4 months earlier, they had asked him to be the president of the NAACP, and I advised him not to. And it was good that he didn't, because if he had done that, then the people would have thought that this was a conspiracy, that the NAACP was behind the Montgomery Improvement Association. But we had 20 minutes after he told me that to put together a speech for that night. That speech was to set the mode for the movement. How could we make it an arousing speech and yet not to push and motivate those present to violence? So in 20 minutes, we crafted a speech that, as I stated, it was going to change the life of Dr. King and also for myself. I was no longer just the first lady of Dexter Avenue, but I now became the first lady of the civil rights movement. During those early days of the movement, the boycott, as you know and you've read, we incurred many threats, bomb threats. I can recall the night that my husband was at Holt Street Baptist Church, and I and Miss Williams and my Firstborn Yoki, Yolanda as we called her, were in the home, and I had just put her in her room, and Miss Williams and I were drinking coffee, and I had this eerie feeling, and I told Miss Williams, let's go to Yoki's room. And when we went to Yoki's room, the entire house started shaking, an explosion. Miss Williams screamed out, "Ah!" We fell to the floor. Heard someone saying, "You're all right?" We didn't know who it was. It was one of the congregation members. Got the word to Martin. He rushed out of the pulpit, came home, hugged us. And by this time, over 300 people had gathered outside of our home with their guns, ready to go forward. And Dr. King, my husband, he went through what was left of the front door. He told them all, "We will not fight violence with violence, but we will fight it with love. Go home. We're all right. If something should happen to me, there will be another one." As I think back on that, for him to say that, I didn't think much of it then. And we were not afraid of death. We had often talked about it. But I look back and I know we were both being prepared. The calls, we would get calls sometimes in the middle of the night, 50 calls a day. I got to the point where I would just start more or less joking about it. So I would pick up the call and say, "King's residence, if you're calling to threaten my husband, he's asleep right now. I'll take your name and your threat, and he will call you in the morning when he's refreshed." Hello? Sometimes they would hang up, and other times they would rant out the hate. My husband was jailed 29 times. I can recall the phone, as I say, and I keep referring to the phone because in my book I'm going to refer that those calls that came from Martin, the threat calls, the calls that came from people who were working with us, and they were from many walks of life. The call from President John F. Kennedy, the evening that my husband was arrested in Georgia for a misdemeanor that he had violated because he was protesting with SNCC, and they had transferred him in the middle of the night to the Georgia State Prison for 4 months of hard labor. President Kennedy called me. He knew that I was expecting, and he assured me he would do everything that he could. And that next morning, my husband was released. We have endured much, and I recall a saying my mother used to say. My mother and father were sharecroppers. We were not entitled, as my husband from a middle-class family, sharecroppers. So early on in my life, I knew what racism, discrimination was. I can recall my father, Obi, and Marion, our sawmill, after my husband my father worked hard. It was burned down 3 days after he purchased it. But you see, he was a sharecropper and then had saved up money to by a truck, and he would haul lumber back and forth and save money. And then we became farmers. And at one time we had over 4,000 chickens. We picked cotton. My father was a barber, and my mother was right there with him. And my father would tell us as we would be waiting for him, and I was the youngest of three, if you look a white man in the face, he won't hurt you. And I don't know what that had to do with his life, but we can recall that he became so prosperous, the prosperous Negro in Marion County, that one night he was coming home and was stopped by two white men. And my father stuttered, and he couldn't get his name out fast enough. He got out of the truck, and they dragged him. He was humiliated, but his strength, his faith and determination, which is what I have and what has held us, my family and Martin, together, I realized I could not be a breakable crystal figurine. I was tested by fire. During the early days of the boycott, money was needed, and so I developed the Freedom Concerts. And the Freedom Concerts, the first concert was held in Manhattan. Harry Belafonte, Duke Ellington secured the space, Manhattan Center. And it was narration of poetry, prose, jazz, folk songs, gospel, spirituals, and classicals. My good friend Langston Hughes was there, as well as Bob Dylan, Pete Seeger. I held over 30 of these concerts to raise money for the movement. It paid the salaries in the early days for the movement. And I would always end with a song from Sister Pollard. I don't know if you've heard of Sister Pollard. She was an early member of our church when we were walking back and forth because we refused to ride the bus. And my husband asked her, she was up in age, he said, "Mother, you know you can ride the bus. We have our own bus. We have our own transportation for you. We have taxis." And she said in all earnesty, she said, "My feet are tired, but my soul is rested." So every Freedom Concert, I would sing the song. And I'd like to share just a part of it because it's a part of my classical training. My feet are tired, but my soul is rested. My arms may be weak, but I'm pressing on. The struggle ain't over till we're brothers and sisters. My feet may be tired, but I'm marching on. And I'd like to go back to the call on the phone. When I received the call, from Andy Young. I had just returned from shopping for new Sunday clothes for my daughters. I came in and Andy said, "Coretta, Doc has been shot. Get here as soon as you can." The phone fell. I fell on my knees. Of course, I was not able to get there in time. He passed an hour later. Many of you will remember the only remembrance you have of me is to grace the occasion, as I did. In the pew, walking behind the mule carriage, carrying my husband's casket. Martin is gone now. It's only been 4 months after, but I know I will continue. I don't know how, but I will. I'm a widower for 4 young children. My youngest is 6, my oldest 14, but I will continue. Would you all please stand and join with me in singing the song that Mahalia Jackson, who was my husband's favorite singer, that hollered out to him so many times, and this is how we formed the speech, I have a dream. Martin, tell him about the dream. I will not stop until we are all one, equal. My husband had a dream, but he was no dreamer. He lived and he walked. He preached nonviolence, but he lived day by day. And so I continue forward living day by day. Please take the hand of the person next to you and let us sing, We Shall Overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. Thank you. God bless you. And before I leave, I have a good friend here who has helped me. He was a part of the NAACP, and now he is a Supreme Court Justice. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, would you please come and give a few words?
Good morning. Please be seated. When a system is created by men, a legal system, their governance, and it's broken, it does evil, it does wrong, that system needs to be changed. And it's the duty of those who are part of that system to help it change. Well, the law, separate but equal in our country after 1896, was wrong. It was evil. And the NAACP as an organization wanted to make changes. And as its legal counsel, it was my job to see that those changes were made. I traveled into the South with other lawyers. I participated in appeals, and we helped win the case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. That change was not the only change that was important, but it recognized that something had been wrong before and would be made right now. Many things have happened in our country since I first became a lawyer in 1930. And the words of the dean of the Howard Law School, who was my mentor, Charles Hamilton Houston, were that we would take separate but equal and we would break it. We would make the equal part cost so much. The faculties at schools, the facilities at schools, because schools were the most important place to change, because without an education, nothing else can happen. Nothing can allow a citizen to gain and understand the full measure of his or her rights, to enjoy the full measure of freedom that our founders gave us when they said, we shall rise, we shall have a more perfect union. And hopefully we will have that by virtue of the law being made straight again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.